Okay, thank you everyone for joining the University of Texas Energy Symposium for today, February 7th, 2023. I'm Carrie King, research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute. And before I formally introduce our speaker for today, I point out our upcoming two talks. Next week, we will have Christopher Argus from Penn State University, and we will have more of a chemistry lesson and him talking about electrochemical hydrogen technologies. And the following week after that, 2 weeks from now, we will have Roger Ames, who's chief scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And we're going to hear about negative emissions technologies like direct air capture of carbon dioxide and these sorts of things. So looking forward to these talks. But today, it is my pleasure here to host William Rees, or Bill Rees, Professor Emeritus of University of British Columbia. Many of you may know of Bill's work. Just a slight short background here. He's a population ecologist, ecological economist, and Professor Emeritus, and former director of the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning. Many of you may know him as the originator and co-developer of the ecological footprint analysis, which shows that the world is in far overshoot, and that we would need 4 Earth-like planets to support the present world population at North American material standards. He's a founding member and former president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics, founding director of One Earth Initiative, fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute, associate fellow of the Great Transition Initiative. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, recipient of the Trudeau Foundation Fellowship, and both the International Boulding Prize, or winner of the Boulding Prize in Ecological Economics and the Blue Planet Prize, together with his former student, Dr. Mathis Wackernagel, for their ecological footprint work. So today he is going to talk to us about cities, and particularly megacities, as he claims are a product of fossil fuels and remain dependent on fossil fuels for new construction, continuous supplies of food, goods, and materials for even basic maintenance. Thus, to decarbonize the economy, avoiding, accelerating, and potentially disastrous climate change, as he says, requires decarbonization of the economy, and problematically, there are as yet no quantitatively adequate substitutes for fossil fuels in many essential uses, including transportation and agriculture, and this has major implications for cities, which he will now describe to us. So thank you for joining us, Bill.
Well, thank you very much.
Over the screen to you. And
Good.
As always, everyone, please submit questions via Q&A. And Bill, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Carrie. You were breaking up a bit there toward the end, so I hope we're back on track here.
Okay, sorry. It's all good.
So obviously, I'm concerned about the question of urbanization in cities in the current era of climate change and what I call incipient energy shortages. So just to give you a quick run over of what I'm going to talk about, it's basically that fossil fuels are a one-time gift, that modern urban civilization would not have evolved without abundant cheap energy. And historically, that has mainly been fossil fuels. And I will further argue that urban civilization can't persist without fossil fuels, certainly not in the short term. The catch is that fossil fuels are the principal enabler of ecological overshoot. They have provided us the means by which we can continue to overexploit the ecosystems and other resources of the planet. And of course, there are other downstream consequences of that in the entropic waste production of modern technology, which induces such things as climate change. I'm going to further argue that mainstream efforts to fix the climate won't fix the climate and will likely worsen overshoot. The problem is that overshoot is ultimately a fatal condition because we're actually destroying the biophysical basis of our own existence. And unless we address overshoot directly, the remaining life of modern urban civilization may well be nasty, brutish, and short. So let's look at how we currently in the mainstream think of our cities. The United Nations and many urban analysts apparently agree that, first of all, we can halt climate change. And we will do this because the future will unfold as a technology-enhanced extension of the relatively recent past. Current projections suggest that urban populations will rise to 6.7 billion by 2050 from a current population of just over 4 billion. By that time, the world is scheduled to have something like 43 megacities, a megacity being one with more than 10 million inhabitants, and that's just by 2030. Now, my premise is that these projections are simplistically reductionist. First of all, the mainstream thinking is very simple, direct cause effect, linear thinking. Humans, generally speaking, don't get complexity. So far, most urban sustainability efforts are single focused on climate change or on so-called smart city initiatives, which are closely related. In other words, we isolate a symptom of overshoot and focus on that and disregard most of the others. So we ignore energy and resource constraints. We ignore the deteriorating geopolitics and accelerating degradation of the ecosphere, which goes far beyond mere climate change. There's virtually no consideration of the Earth's carrying capacity or the need for high-income city dwellers to achieve material standards consistent with one planet living. We've only got one Earth, and our current modus operandus is to convert the whole of the ecosphere into human beings and our artifacts. And of course, we depend on those, the productive capacity of the ecosphere to keep the whole thing going. But even those cities, focusing on climate change are falling short in reducing even their carbon emissions. So to summarize, we take a very narrow view of the dilemma that we're in, focusing on climate change in isolation from virtually everything else, and we're not even doing a very good job in dealing with climate change. There's another major perceptual error in all of these projections about urbanization. We are frequently told that urbanized land only comprises something like 3% of the world's total habitable land area. And therefore, population growth and associated urbanization is a non-issue. I mean, 3%, what's that? But this too is static simplicity. Cities are dynamic living systems. An urban ecosystem is globally dispersed far beyond the city proper. When we do ecological footprint analysis, we can show the following. Your eco footprint is essentially a measure of the quantity or the area of ecosystems on Earth needed to sustain you and the lifestyle to which you are accustomed. So a city's true ecological footprint, the area it actually occupies on the Earth, is the total area of productive ecosystems that the population of that city requires continuously to produce the bioresources it consumes and to assimilate its carbon wastes wherever on Earth those ecosystems are located. And when we do these kinds of analyses, we can show that urban ecological footprints, the actual ecological area required to sustain a city, typically 100 to 1,000 times larger, depending on income and urban densities and so on, larger than the city's built up or political areas. So if we take an example, excuse me, it's not really a typical city, of course, because Tokyo is the world's largest city with a population in the greater Tokyo area approaching 38 million. That, by the way, is the whole population of Canada, but only 30% of Japan's population. But the per capita footprint of Japanese is about 4.5 global average hectares. So it amounts to 171 million global average hectares. That's a hectare of global average productivity. And this means that Tokyo requires to sustain its current lifestyles something like 2.5 times the entire domestic biocapacity of Japan. So the deficit, which is very large, so more than twice the amount of Japan's carrying capacity, is taken up or at least supplied by imports from elsewhere. Tokyo and Japan generally is a completely trade-dependent city. And again, it's because the amazing consumption of cities like this are supplied by hinterlands scattered all over the world and facilitated by globalization and trade, which I would argue is the single largest mechanism by which human beings are depleting the planet. So if we look at cities in this light, cities account for something like 75 to 80% of global consumption and pollution. They're only about 60% of the population, but they're the richer part of the population. So to sustain just today's urban population requires the equivalent of about 125% of the long-term productive or assimilative capacity of the planet. Now people say, how can you be taking more than there is? And the answer is because we're drawing down the natural capital. You can fish a fish stock at 125% its replacement rate until you run out of fish, of course. But that's what we're doing to our assets all over the planet. Soils are degrading, biodiversity is crumbling, and so on and so forth. We depend mainly on fossil fuels, diesel trucks, ships, most trains to build, maintain, and provision our cities with resources extracted from their extended hinterlands all over the world. And this overexploitation, also known as overshoot, means that the growth and maintenance of urban regions is being financed in part by liquidating and polluting the essential natural capital upon which human civilization depends. Excuse me. This is a very important graph. There's a lot of information here. Basically, it's a plot of human population growth over the last 10,000 years. So we've gone from fewer than 4 million estimated back 10,000 years ago at the dawn of agriculture, and we hit 8 billion people in November of 2022, just a couple of months ago. But most of that growth, 90% of it or more, has occurred in just the last couple of hundred years or so. So we've seen an enormous expansion of the human enterprise since about 1800. During that period, our use of fossil fuel has increased by a factor of 1,400. The human population has increased by a factor of 8. And gross world product has increased by 103-fold. This is in real terms, and that roughly correlates with our rate of resource consumption. This means that on average on Earth, per capita consumption has increased 13 or 14 times, and perhaps 25 or 30 times in rich countries like Canada and the United States. So we had, if you think of modern humans being about 250,000 years old, we had almost that entire period of barely detectable growth, because negative feedback was keeping in check the natural propensity of all populations to expand exponentially. But around the early part of the 19th century, when we really got heavily into fossil fuels relieved us of the negative feedback. We suddenly had all the resources, the food and the resources we needed to expand the human enterprise. And of course, technology helped to improve population health. So for the first time in humans' 250,000-year history, we were able to realize our full potential for exponential growth. And that's what we've seen for just the last 200 years, as this graph clearly illustrates. But the real point to take from this is that continuous population and economic growth is an anomaly. It's abnormal. The exponential growth spurt that only 10 generations take to be normal, that's 10 generations in the last 200 years, is actually the single most abnormal period in human history. So everything we hear about the necessity to maintain growth because we depend on it is really a very short-term memory. And again, examples of our rather simplistic thinking. I put a little note here, what goes up will come down, and I think I'll return to that just a bit later. Now, I've made the point that much of this has been dependent on fossil fuel. And in fact, we can plot the increase in population against the increase in fossil fuel, or rather vice versa. And we can see here that fossil fuel use has also grown exponentially along with the population. Indeed, it was the fossil fuel growth that enabled growth of the population. And again, this is exponential growth. So the downward arrow at 1920, or rather 1992, indicates a very important point, because the area under the curve to the right and to the left of that point is roughly equal. Half of the fossil fuels and many other resources ever used by human beings have been consumed in your lifetimes, or at least the lifetimes of many of you in just the past 30 years. I was born in 1943, and it's astonishing to realize, that's the other arrow on the far left there, that 90% of fossil fuels ever used by humans have been burned since 1945. 43. That's the power of exponential growth. And if I can go back to this curve, almost all of this growth has occurred, obviously, in that last increment of this exponential growth boom. Okay, so Albert Bartlett, a very well-known physicist from the University of Colorado, the late Albert Bartlett, argued that the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential growth function. So very briefly, what it says is that any variable growing exponentially at a fixed rate has a constant doubling time, so that the quantity reached at the end of any doubling is greater than the sum of the quantities reached at the end of all previous doublings. That's how we can say that in just the last 30 years, we used as much energy as in all previous history. So growing at just 2.5% per year, which economists would argue is a fairly minimal rate of growth, both the global economy, which is basically to say gross world product, and probably consumption of resource use, because most people on Earth are not yet fully into the material age, are expected to double by 2050. Should this occur, the quantity of many resource commodities, including energy, that will be consumed in the next roughly 30 years, will be greater than the total quantity that has been consumed to date by urban industrial civilization. And the scale of anticipated waste generation is proportionate. So this is really an astonishing way to look at things, that we're already grossly into overshoot, and we anticipate that we're going to not only continue on this path, but use more energy and material in the next 30 years than we've used to date in human history to get us there. By the way, if you think of the so-called energy transition and the demands it's placing on many rare metals and minerals, we will mine more of those minerals in the next 30 years than have ever been mined in human history. Copper, for example, I think we've mined something like 700 million tons. We will double that in the next 30 years just to supply the anticipated growth in demand for copper, electronic vehicles, and so on. All of this suggests to me that climate change is a distraction from a much greater systemic meta problem. And that meta problem I've already referred to as ecological overshoot. And we can define that quite simply. The human enterprise is using even renewable resources faster than ecosystems can regenerate, and we're producing wastes in excess of the ecosphere's assimilative capacities. In fact, we are currently using the Earth as if it were 75% larger than it actually is. We are literally consuming and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence. I could spend 3 or 4 days describing the many dimensions of this problem. So that virtually all so-called environmental problems, including climate change, are mere symptoms of overshoot. Climate change is a waste management problem. Carbon dioxide is the single greatest waste product by weight from industrial economies. Now, the problem is that overshoot, which we're well into, is a fatal condition, and I regard it as the overriding threat to urban civilization. So based on those facts, and I think they are facts, you can confirm them by a few hours of research, can anyone reasonably believe that the human enterprise can safely maintain our present growth trajectory, which is doubling GDP, gross world product, by 2050, and that the urbanization can continue unimpeded on a planet, a finite planet, already far into overshoot? Which leads us into the second part of this presentation, and that's a more direct examination of the fossil fuel and urbanization connection. So modern cities and megacities, as I argued, are products of and couldn't exist without abundant, cheap energy. Yeah, big cities could exist, a few 100,000 perhaps, but the fact is cities of 37 million, like Tokyo, 38 million, or Shanghai, I guess it's 26 or 27 million, or New York at 8 or 10 million, are simply not possible in the absence of abundant, cheap energy. And historically, this has meant fossil fuels. And for the foreseeable future, it seems that fossil fuels are likely to continue to dominate our energy budget. But wait a minute, people will call. What about the limits that have been suggested by the various so-called COP agreements, the Paris Accord on climate change? So to quote from that accord, the world must hold the rise in global average temperatures to, quote, well below 2 Celsius degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we will pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 Celsius degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this means that we need to reduce carbon emissions by 50% below 2010 levels, basic current levels, by 2030. And that means 8% per year beginning now. And we need to achieve complete carbonization by 2050. So that's what we've agreed to. But if you look at the real numbers here, and I underscored this in red below, it's actually no longer possible to meet the 1.5 Celsius degree warming limit. More than 5.5 degrees additional warming is already in the pipeline. We've known this, climate scientists have known this for some time. They've always argued, in fact, that the 1.5 Celsius degree limit was a political, certainly not a scientific criteria. And most recently, if you look up James Hansen et al. In 2022, they argued that, quote, eventual global warming due just to today's greenhouse forcing after slow feedbacks operate is about 10 degrees Celsius, which is the end of civilization on the planet if it were to go to that extent. So, not to worry, we're being told over and over again. So-called green renewable energy is taking over. Solar, photovoltaic, and wind power are rapidly getting cheaper and more abundant, so much so that they are on track to entirely supplant fossil fuels worldwide within 2 decades. Well, that was a paper from 2018. There's dozens since then that make the same point, but they're completely unrealistic. For example, just look online, look up costs of wind towers and so on. Wind towers and solar panels are neither green nor renewable, and many wind turbine producers are on the verge of bankruptcy for a whole bunch of technical reasons and are currently begging for yet more subsidies so that they can keep their heads above economic waters. In any case, we're told not to worry because renewable energy is taking over, except it's really not. This is a fairly recent graph of global energy by source. In fact, I've updated it to the most recent numbers in red on the right-hand side there. In 2022, wind and solar together were about 5% of global primary energy. Fossil fuels were still 82%. So if we were to end fossil fuel use abruptly, then large cities would be abandoned and hundreds of millions of people would likely perish from food and other resource shortages, civil strife, and geopolitical chaos. Again, just to underscore what we're up against here. In 2021, fossil energy powered the world for about 300 out of 365 days. Wind and solar gave us just 18 days. And that's where the great promise is. It is growing rapidly, but primarily in the electrical sector. And after 30 years of growth, we've reached 18 days of energy for the world at large. Fossil fuels still dominate. That's the nature of the game here. And by the way, I want you to recognize that I mentioned that half of fossil fuels have been used since 1990. This graph shows that once again, and it's precisely the period during which we see this flurry of negotiations to control climate change. So in fact, the path to climate change is strewn with failed climate agreements, but also massive growth in the use of fossil fuels. So that after 50 years, 26 COP conferences on the climate, a half a dozen major international agreements to control carbon emissions, and various scientists' warning, we've actually failed utterly to reduce atmospheric carbon concentrations. So at the most recent of the COP conferences at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, just in November, we were already broaching 418 parts per million on average, and that's almost 50% above pre-industrial levels of atmospheric carbon. Now, again, I have to underscore that there's no indication on this curve that any of these climate agreements have taken place. One could argue that things would be worse without them, but the fact of the matter is, if the goal is to reduce atmospheric carbon concentrations, we've utterly failed to do so. And during this entire period, we've seen an exponential increase in the growth of fossil fuels and our dependence on same. Well, the very recent, it's almost, I think, less than a month old, British Petroleum's annual energy outlook for 2023 is out. They've published 3 possible scenarios. I've summarized them here. The net zero scenario, this is what is needed if we were actually to limit our warming to 1.5 Celsius degrees. It's a pipe dream. It won't occur voluntarily. And in any case, I've already mentioned that the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is completely out of reach. So it seems to me just pointless to put this up there. The accelerated scenario, meaning much tighter policies to limit greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And this is absolutely required to limit warming to less than 2 Celsius degrees, would require not only tightening policies, but major lifestyle changes. And so far, we don't hear any major country or nation or politician at any level talking about massive changes in lifestyles. The most likely scenario, they call the new momentum. New momentum because there have been considerable discussions about fixing things in recent years. So this is the present path, and it assumes that world maintains current rates of progress. And if we do that, we will only experience 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming by 2100. But that is catastrophic for civilization, getting what, taking into account the effect of just 1.1 degree increase already. Also from the BP Energy Outlook, rather, we can see the nature of our energy profile at the end of this period of 2050. Fossil fuels are still the dominant source of energy. Renewables have increased remarkably. Coal is down substantially, but emissions are only reduced to the same level that they had reached by about 2000. So yes, it's progress, assuming this new momentum carries on, but it's not going to get us anywhere close to what is required to avoid catastrophic or at least accelerating climate change. The United States Energy Information Administration has very similar data. Here we can see their projections out to 2050 rather. This is the most likely scenario. Petroleum and other liquids and natural gas increase, while other renewable energy increase even faster. Coal is way down, but again, the dominant source of energy is still fossil fuels in that 30-year period of economic growth. Okay, so I would argue we are really at the horns of a dilemma here, a climate energy conundrum that is a major threat to any city that doesn't have a plan B. So the first option is to rapidly decarbonize, which is what the adhering to the climate agreement schedule would be all about. 8% reductions starting now for at least the next 8 or 9 years to 2030. That gets us down to half of our current emissions, and then we'd have to eliminate the rest by 2050. But if we do that to avoid disastrous climate change, we risk, and these things sound extreme to many people, but I'm just taking them from the literature. I'm not making anything up here. I'm just the literature. And it suggests inadequate energy supplies, broken supply lines, food and other resource shortages, local famines, reduced production, declining incomes, rising inequality, widespread unemployment, civil unrest, abandoned cities, mass migrations, collapsed economies, and geopolitical chaos. We do not have an adequate, in quantitative terms, substitutes for fossil fuels at the present time. We are utterly dependent on fossil fuels. That huge explosion of human populations and artifacts we've experienced in the last 20 years are the product of a fountain of fossil fuels. The second option is to remain largely dependent on fossil fuels. And I've already shown that seems to be society's default position. And this would say the means by which we would maintain the growth paradigm. But if we do this, we risk more and longer heat waves, extended droughts, desertification, melting permafrost, methane releases, which would accelerate climate change, water shortages, failing agriculture, famines, rising sea levels, the flooding and eventual loss of many coastal cities, uninhabitable regions, mass migrations, collapsed economies, and geopolitical chaos. So neither of these options looks very well, again, just based on things you can extract from the literature. So we have to ask, why is this? Well, there are many, many reasons, but they all contribute to what we would call the formation of politically acceptable solutions. And basically, these reflect vested interests or corporate interests more than they do the common good. They include any capital-intensive techno-fix, wind and solar powers, electronic vehicles, non-existent carbon capture and storage technologies. You're going to hear about them in a couple of weeks, I gather. Geoengineering, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are designed to ensure what I call business as usual by alternative means. Clive Spash, a very well-known European ecological economist, has said, in short, disaster policy is being designed to serve the capitalist growth-based economy so that the latter becomes the solution to and is not seen as the cause of the problem. So we're stuck in this self-producing paradigm of economic growth, which refuses to see anything outside of itself or other possibilities. So what the mainstream refuses to acknowledge is that the dance between energy supply and overshoot climate change poses an unprecedented challenge to the existence of contemporary urban society, particularly megacities. Acceptable approaches to climate change will not fix the climate and will exacerbate overshoot. By the way, we've seen the effect of the acceptable approaches to climate change. They're not fixing the climate. And remember, if we don't address overshoot, large swaths of Earth will become uninhabitable. So this is a wonderful cartoon. I often think editorial cartoonists say it a lot better than any number of academic papers. Humans think simplistically. We're not used to complex problem solving, certainly not in the street. Most of our politicians have no idea what complexity science is all about. And so we seek simple answers that happen to be dead wrong. What we're getting then is what I call business as usual by alternative means, which leads to worsening climate and extended overshoot, and then potential societal collapse. What we need is a plan B. If we really face these problems directly, it would mean engineering smaller ecological footprints, changes in lifestyles to reduce consumption, not only through efficiency, but changing the way we use all goods and materials. We need absolute reductions in material and energy consumption. And we need population planning leading to a more just or equitable sustainability. I thought I'd throw this in. I'm a population ecologist, and to me, this is a very fascinating curve. Well, I drew this curve, but it's based on real data out there. First of all, you can see the red line is our current trajectory. We've gone past the long-term carrying capacity of the Earth. People say, well, how can that be? We're still here. Well, that's why we're seeing climate change. That's why we're seeing the collapse of fish stocks, the erosion of soils, biodiversity depletion at unprecedented rates. We're literally consuming and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence. And when other animal populations are exposed to abundance, short-term abundance because of excellent climate or unusual productivity of their food sources, they too go into overshoot. Every species is capable of exponential growth. Humans are no different. But after a period of time, those population explosions deplete their resources or pollute their environments. And so they create the very conditions that leads to the reinstallment or reinstatement, rather, of a negative feedback. Starvation, disease spread, rapid increases in predation, and so on and so forth. So the boom phase of the population outburst is followed by a bust phase. So I would argue that based just on the shape of these curves and our incapacity to maintain that growth trajectory without destroying the planet, that we are arguably nearing the peak of a one-off population boom-bust cycle. Now that means the population and all of our civilizational artifacts are going to decline. But we can't expect to come back to the former carrying capacity of the Earth, because when you're in overshoot, you're depleting that carrying capacity down this red dotted line here. So the best we might have achieved was one planet living, had we actually taken seriously scientists and climate change warnings back 50 or 60 years ago. Now we have to follow the dotted red line here and stabilize at a population that is sustainable by the remaining productive capacity of the planet. And many scientists think this is around 1 to 2 billion people. Okay, So this is, as I say, an analogy with other populations, and there's no real reason, it seems to me, to suggest that humans are that much different, particularly since we've ignored all of the warnings to get us this far. So what should a city do if it was really serious about this? Here's plan B. First of all, any city that hopes to survive should formally acknowledge the existence of overshoot and the end of growth. They should be pressuring national and provincial and state governments to restructure the economy to remain within the allowable carbon budget while developing or improving sustainable energy alternatives. I'm not against alternative energy, obviously. I'm just saying that presently we don't have it. And by the way, some argue that there is no remaining alternative or allowable carbon budget. If there is, we should allocate any remaining fossil fuel budget to essential uses only: food production, home heating, and transportation needed to provision cities. In the absence of these measures, particularly the transportation measure, we simply cannot continue to sustain our cities. Just stand on a major highway and watch the influx and outflux of trucks moving goods into the city and waste out every single day on a continuous basis. We should halt all greenfield expansion because we're going to need it to produce our food, particularly if we abandon fossil fuel foreign fertilizers. We need to reorganize our settlements into more self-reliant, urban-centered, steady-state bioregions that are integrated into local ecosystems. And we should be negotiating a global population strategy to plan a descent to the 2 to 3 billion that might be able to live comfortably indefinitely within the means of nature. So some very specific policies would be to phase out essential and frivolous uses of fossil fuels. All private automobiles, including EVs, ATVs, jet skis, leaf blowers, non-essential air travel, and so on. We need to establish fossil fuel extraction quotas and allocate allowable surpluses to essential uses: agriculture, food processing, interurban truck transportation, and so on. I've mentioned some of these before. We need to implement broad-scale pollution charges, including carbon taxes and resource depletion taxes, which means to internalize the social and ecological externalities of resource use through what we call full social cost pricing. By the way, if this were to happen, it would put many current so-called essentials beyond the price point affordable by many people, which of course is the name of the game here. We're trying to reduce material throughput. We should be relocalizing essential manufacturing and food production processing to reduce our dependence on unreliable global supply chains. The war, the Russian attack on the Ukraine has exposed the fragility, the lack of resilience in the world system by showing how dependent Europe is on Russian energy, for one thing, but also the world on fertilizers manufactured using natural gas from Russia, and so on. It's a very fragile global economy we've created. It's an economy that assumes business as usual continue indefinitely, even as we undermine the basis for business as usual. We should be downsizing our housing. In the 50s, the average new house was 1,000 square feet. Today, it's over 2,500 square feet, even as the average family size has declined very significantly, so that we're using more space than ever per capita. Our housing, even if it's better insulated, is far less sustainable than it was 60 years ago. We should be building all new construction to what is called passive house standards. There's a whole literature on this, but basically it means making them 80% more energy efficient than current construction in North America. We should be reforming our income and corporate tax systems for greater equality and implement a minimum income strategy. We should be investing in the restoration of essential ecosystems and life support services. Well, I'm arguing none of that's happening because we're in a paradigmatic trap. Those things that are ecologically and socially necessary for sustainability, and I've tried to list some that I think should be up there, are politically infeasible. But those measures that are politically feasible are ecologically and socially ineffective when they're not absolutely catastrophic. So I think, again, cartoonists sometimes get it better than any academic paper. Assuming present trends continue, the odds are quite good that humankind will become the best informed extinct species on the planet. Well, we're not going to go extinct, but certainly we're headed for a dramatic revision in our way of viewing the future. And that's my way of looking at the world right now. Thank you very much and enjoy your lunch. Thanks, Carrie King, for inviting me to talk to you all.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I'm going to attempt to use both of my logins here due to the sound quality on my end, as you pointed out. So before I can follow up some questions with you, but here's a follow-up question from the audience, some questions coming in. So I guess you're kind of discussing about the likelihood of these policies you're talking about, but this question is essentially asking that, are there any movements towards accepting these kinds of policies, ecological footprint? I mean, some countries are claiming to adopt this one way or another. Is there do you see any progress going towards the policies you suggest?
Not officially, not in informal governments. I mean, look, there's a lot of use of ecological footprint analysis. I think at least a dozen countries and even the European Commission, which had originally taken issue with the, I suppose, the results of the analysis undertaken by people in the Global Footprint Network, they insisted on redoing those calculations. And of course, they have access to their best data. And what they've shown over and over again, that the eco-footprint estimates for those countries, cities, and indeed the whole of Europe were essentially within 3 to 5% of the results that we originally obtained. I think Europe uses about 3 times as much biocapacity outside of its own boundaries as it was located in Europe. And again, the European Commission findings apparently confirm that. So my point is, yes, people are aware of these data, but they don't act on them. I think psychologists will tell us that once we're, I suppose, habitually entrained in a particular way of thinking and being and doing, and have a huge, not only financial, but psychological commitment to that, then it takes a massive catastrophic event to make people change their minds. So even though the data, I mean, look at all of the data I've shown us that indicate the direction we are headed, it's not sufficient to turn the ship around. And simply, it just hasn't had that effect at the official level. That said, at the popular level, there are a number of things that are extremely interesting. So we see in Europe, much more so than in North America, something called the degrowth movement. A large number of scientists, social scientists, and non-governmental organizations have put together a program for the downsizing of economic activity. So far, they've been unwilling to grasp the population level, but certainly they argue that we can't survive on this planet without enormous strife and ecological implosion unless we shrink the economy to be accommodated within the biocapacity of the planet. And this requires then a massive, again, change in our lifestyles, a much greater degree of sharing of the wealth among people. We must address the equity question. What, 8 or 10 billionaires today hold as much wealth as the poorest half of the human population of 4 billion people. Well, that's an egregious injustice that is clearly exacerbating the problem and can't carry on. So yes, there are literally hundreds of non-governmental organizations and popular organizations that are coming together to recognize these problems and urging governments to do something, but they don't yet have the ear of the policyholders. If you look at the United States, I think it's fairly clear that the whole government is in effect subject to a process called agency capture, where the regulatory agencies are being essentially appropriated by the organizations, the corporate sector that they're set up to regulate. And they now act more in the corporate interests than they do in the popular interest. So you see a revolving door of executives between the government agencies and major corporate interests and so on. To get elected to Congress or the Senate requires millions of dollars, corporate donations. And people don't give you millions of dollars without expecting something in return. So if you have a government that is essentially captive to the financial sector, to the corporate sector, then it's often impossible to get movements going that are in the interest of the wider public interest. So we got lots of problems ahead of us.
Right. Okay. Here's another question about the difference between, I guess, the consumption of the average person or the whole city in general, depending on the size. If we think about a small town or rural areas and cities, and so the question, the person I'm just going to read, I would assume rural populations consume more energy, perhaps per person, due to transportation of goods and services. So how do does this mean it's more efficient to encourage people to move to cities still? So how do you think about the, I guess, belief, perception, reality of rural versus urban living and sustainability?
Well, it's a huge question. I mean, we've got so little time, but if you look at this issue globally, why do people move to cities? They move to cities for economic opportunities, higher incomes. What happens when you have higher incomes? Your consumption goes up. So it's completely mythic to assume that urbanization is more energy or material efficient than living in rural areas. The movement of populations to cities has meant a great increase in the average per capita footprint because of rising incomes and rising consumption generally that goes with those rising incomes. Even in the United States and Canada, rural areas are relatively poorer than are our big burgeoning cities. And even though, say, somebody living in New York might not have to drive so far, any savings that they make are spent on overseas travel. For example, a couple of airline flights every year wipes out any gain you might have made by not driving your fossil fuel powered vehicle much further. So the bottom line is that rural living can be much less impactful on the environment than urban living, at least as we construct it right now. The problem is, it seems inconceivable to me without major disruptions in a whole variety of ways to redistribute the current urban population. Look at, again, that example of Tokyo. One city with a third of the population of Japan in a country in which that one city uses twice the total biocapacity of the nation. What now? How do we deal with that? How will China deal with 26 or 7 million people in Shanghai if the anticipated 60 centimeters to a meter of sea level rise in the next 50 to 60 years, it displaces those many millions of people into the countryside? These are the kinds of things we should be thinking of, but are not, because we're stubbornly stuck on the current trajectory.
Okay, thank you. Question here, how can governments address the inequity between countries that contribute to overshoot the most and countries that are most affected by overshoot? Or how do we think about this country disparity? You mentioned the billionaire inequity, and this one's maybe more at the policy level. I don't know.
Again, this is a huge problem because we've recently seen conferences trying to deal with precisely this question. So countries make commitments to provide billions of dollars of revenue to those countries most seriously affected by consumption largely taking place in those rich countries, but then we don't follow through very much. Another way of doing this, I mean, if people seem enamored with market mechanisms, supposing we were able to show, and I think economists have shown, that the Brazilian rainforest intact is far more valuable than it is cut down for beef farming or soybean growing or whatever it is that we're depleting the Amazon for. Now, if that's the case, if we really believe that, and I think the economic case is fairly solid, then the rich countries should be taxing themselves to pay Brazil not to develop the rainforest. And if Brazil had any economic sense, they would recognize that the revenue stream from this flow of income from rich countries in the north would be much greater than any economic gains from further development of the Amazon. So we would essentially be using market forces to preserve and conserve those areas of the earth upon which we are all dependent for one thing or another. So there's a whole variety of mechanisms here. that would result in massive wealth transfers from the countries most seriously affected, from those countries that are benefiting the most to those that are most seriously affected. But how do you compensate, say, the Maldives, which country will disappear by the end of the century due to rising sea level? Again, it's a huge problem, and we haven't begun seriously to address these issues, even though theoretically the solutions are at hand. They're just extremely uncomfortable. And any government that suggested we should tax ourselves in the billions of dollars to buy forest in some other country would probably be overthrown because of the general level of ignorance at the population level. We're really doing this to save our own necks. Human beings are extremely, what we call, we're discount oriented. You know about this, Carrie. We would much rather risk future damage to other populations elsewhere than immediate damage to ourselves right now to avoid that future damage. So we tend to discount the future. We prefer our present lifestyles, our immediate family and friends, our own home places to other people living elsewhere in countries that we don't even know very well. And for that reason, there's enormous resistance and resentment to any suggestion that we have to act now to save these other places, when in fact we'd be acting to save ourselves.
Right. Well, I guess at least one South American country called out the Europeans and North Americans a little bit to prevent extraction of oil in the rainforest. And, you know, pay us to not extract it if it's that important for climate change. And yeah, we didn't take them up on it.
No, we did not. But that's a perfect example of what I'm getting at. We should have been more than willing to pay for the non-development of those oil resources.
Right. Okay. So here's another question. Let's see. I guess I'll phrase it roughly as a question here. It says, do some of the interventions that you suggest for sustainability towards the end of your presentation, I suppose, worsen inequalities at national or subnational scales? And does this cause some sort of potentially uniquely human trait where, in order to, I don't know, perhaps pursue a more sustainable footprint, that the stronger might continue to take advantage of the weaker, or the rich continue to take more advantage of the poor? So how do you kind of overcome this tendency in the context of perhaps drawing down the population as well?
Yeah, again, these are enormous questions. I'm not a social scientist, but maybe you put your finger right on a major problem here. Many of the suggestions that would be necessary to reduce our consumption would disadvantage poor people. There's no question about that. And that's why I suggested in one line at the bottom that we need to consider a minimum income policy that would tax the rich to enable the poor to at least live at subsistence or better levels. So there are ways we can address these issues, but so far have shown utter unwillingness to do so. Look at the difficulty in the United States of getting any serious conversation about an effective carbon tax, never mind a full social cost pricing on everything else. People are simply utterly resistant to the idea of higher taxes. And in fact, most of the last several decades have seen increasing accelerated reduction in taxes. And it's really astonishing to me how this all has come about. If you go back to I guess the Nixon era, if I'm not mistaken, the marginal tax rate for the 1% was something like 94 or 97%. So the richest people in the United States would have to pay 94% of every additional dollar earned to government coffers. But every president since Nixon has reduced that rate, so that now the average marginal tax rate for the super wealthy is only 34 or 35%. So you've seen a gradual shift in the tax policy, not in the direction that I'm talking about, toward greater equity or toward paying for our depletion of nature, but toward increasing the accumulative wealth of the 1%. We now take something like 80% of the national income growth that occurs every year. So it's completely perverse, and yet it's allowed to happen in a democracy because, as I say, democracy has essentially been captured by corporate interests and is working not against those corporate interests, but against the public interest. And many of those corporate leaders are buying up big chunks of countries like New Zealand and installing retreat bunkers because they see the writing on the wall and are going to assume that their wealth can protect them from the impending implosion. So these are huge problems that affect every one of us.
Okay, you might have addressed the next question in your just previous answer there, which was amongst the policies for controlled contraction that you mentioned in your presentation, which is perhaps the most important one to focus on, or if you focused on one. So you mentioned at least here, I guess, higher marginal tax rates to prevent such accumulation of wealth by a few people. Is that it, or should we think about something else?
Well, if you just think about that, what's the likelihood of it happening in the current political climate? And I think it's one of the most effective things that we could possibly do as a society is to recognize that the way the entire economy is currently structured, we have a structural problem. It's a system for pumping wealth to the already wealthy at the expense of the relatively impoverished. And I might add, at the expense of the depletion of the natural capital, the biophysical assets upon which we all depend. This is really important. We are engaged in a thermodynamic conversion process where the production of more human bodies and more artifacts of civilization requires the consumption of a vast quantity, and this is getting a bit technical, but of negentropic resources produced by nature to produce a much smaller quantity of utility for human beings, but at the expense of an enormous output of so-called entropic waste, including carbon dioxide and the pollution of just about everything out there. So we are engaged right now in our global economy in a massive pyramid scheme that is destroying the future basis of existence of civilization and to feed the ones who got in there first. That is to say, the current generation, particularly the current generation of extremely wealthy people. This pyramid scheme will collapse. It cannot continue. The only question that the ordinary person should be thinking about is how will that come about? Will it be an orderly implosion, one in which the public interest and common good is taken into account, or will it be a chaotic implosion in which the wealthy take off to Mars or New Zealand at best, and the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves?
Right. Let's see, we'll go to this one here. I guess it's just a question about technology and perhaps generally, but specifically they're asking about green hydrogen. What's the ability for that to alleviate some of the problems you discussed? I might sort of add on to that and rephrase it. Do you think, I think you already kind of spoke on sort of the more technological solutions just kind of being more of the same and not addressing the overshoot problem, but does it minimize potentially the rate of chaos or the level of chaos as you might be discussing from a reckoning of global overshoot?
Well, look, alternative energy is a hugely controversial issue, as many of you are obviously aware. First of all, I think Dr. King has made a very important point. Let's assume for the sake of argument that the alternative energy proponents are correct, that wind, solar, green hydrogen, and so on, within the next couple of decades rises to the point where it can quantitatively substitute for fossil fuels. What have we solved? All this does is provide us with abundant, cheap energy to enable the continued overexploitation of all the other resources on the planet. So in one sense, what looks like a salvation would sound the death knell for biodiversity and ultimately civilization. So we've got that big problem. The second issue is that if you look at hydrogen right now, I'm again not totally immersed in analyzing hydrogen, but it's increasingly attracting investment. But most hydrogen is produced with a net energy loss. Even green hydrogen, which is produced theoretically by using solar or wind electricity to hydrolyze water to produce hydrogen and oxygen, why would you use high-grade electricity at an energetic loss to produce hydrogen, which would then be burnt in, I don't know, fuel cells, but why not use the electricity directly? There's a lot of weird mechanics going on here that I don't fully understand. I suppose there are some applications where hydrogen is the only thing you could use, but it does seem to me that if the production of hydrogen, and as I say, most major ways today of producing hydrogen involve natural gas, for example, our net energy sinks, it's not a viable option at the present time. And much of the hype around it is simply to attract investment to get better. Sure, and we may get better at it. But again, does that solve the problem of overshoot? My answer to that is no. In fact, it doesn't even solve the problem of carbon emissions in the short term.
Right. I'll maybe ask a follow-up here on what you just said. So suppose that the, I'd say some of the usual arguments for pursuing hydrogen are for transportation needs, perhaps industrial processes needs for which electricity is not sufficient. You can't generate enough heat by electricity, or we don't know how to store enough for long-haul trucking, or creating either hydrogen directly or syn fuels based upon hydrogen recombination. So I'm guessing this probably doesn't change your viewpoint, but let's just say somebody said, well, we want hydrogen for the difficult to electrify options. And would you say anything different to that use of hydrogen, or the reason for pursuing it?
No, I just think there are enormous technical problems associated with production of hydrogen on that scale, including the fact that it's very difficult to contain. It causes the chemical changes in metals, for example, that results in their becoming very brittle and subject to leakage. So I just don't see, let me just be very clear about this. Technology is wonderful. We're going to make advances in technology. We don't have the time for the usual play out of these technological advances. So if it takes 20 or 30 years for hydrogen to make a significant dent, it's too late. So again, these are hugely complicated issues. There are numerous technical objections to the hydrogen economy. I've been hearing about it for most of my career. Ballard Energy Systems way back in the 70s in Vancouver was one of the leaders in hydrogen fuel cell technology, still is. But we haven't made much progress in that 50-year period. And is it going to take another 50 years before hydrogen becomes a major player in the game? If it does, it will be too late to really address the kinds of issues that we're facing right now.
Right. Okay, well, we'll maybe finish up here with just a couple they're in the same theme, I guess, but people have asked the questions here on the technology theme. So we've got, just to summarize here, we got 3: solar, geothermal, nuclear. But specifically on solar, the questioner here is pointing out that you might have implied something about the net energy gain of solar panels, this kind of idea. Did you mean to imply that solar panels don't generate as much energy as it takes to make them over their lifetime? That's kind of the specific question here. And then anything else you want to say about nuclear or geothermal as well?
Okay, look, this whole question of so-called energy return on energy investment is enormously complicated. So if we look at solar panels, the literature just covers the ballpark. Some advocates think solar panels have a net energy return over their lifetimes of tenfold or more, which puts them certainly in the same league as fossil fuels at present. But there are other analyses that are more, I suppose, comprehensive, that take solar panels from their source at the mine site and follow the entire life cycle. And when they looked at the entire systems in Germany, in Switzerland, in I guess Spain, what they show is that at best, the return is only about, I think, net return is 1.3 to 1.4 to 1, which is insufficient to run civilization. In fact, in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken, solar panel installations have been a net loss of energy in this very comprehensive net energy kind of analysis. And again, it obviates the obvious overshoot issue completely. So solar panels, it's a controversy. And we have to also recall that solar panels and wind towers, and for that matter, hydrogen at this point are all fossil fuel dependent. None of these alternative energy systems are self-producing. Here's what would convince me about the vitality of solar energy. I would like to see a village example, a village scale or city scale example, where solar panels generate the energy necessary to power the mining equipment, the transportation trucks, the manufacturing and refining. In other words, the entire solar panel cycle being powered by solar panels, plus producing enough energy to power that community. No energy source is a viable energy source until it produces sufficient energy to produce itself entirely from the ground up, plus provide sufficient surplus energy to run all of civilization. And so far, only fossil fuels are clearly able to do so. I'm not saying it's not possible that others could do so, but so far they are not. Solar energy and wind power is so far very largely fossil fuel dependent. If you look at the literature currently in wind technology, most of the manufacturers are going bankrupt. The towers aren't lasting nearly as long, that they're having huge technical problems. Siemens Energy, the largest producer in Europe, lost $1 billion last year. They're now asking for more bailouts from government because of these technical problems. I don't think solar is in quite that kind of mess, but the point is these great promises are not being fulfilled at nearly the rate needed to satisfy their own dreams. And in any case, even if successful, they don't address the overshoot question. So a very long answer. Solar panels have to prove themselves in the way that I suggested, and so far they can't do that.
All right. Yeah, I think I probably generally agree with your notion. I might devil's advocate of any one particular technology, and defining one technology separate from the others, it's pretty difficult down the line, like metals, right? Or metals are not a fossil fuel, but of course, doing all of our modern industry and societies uses metals, right? Well, I think perhaps we'll end it there, Bill. So thank you very much for joining us. If you or anyone else is interested in at least hydrogen storage that you mentioned, we have a talk 4 weeks from now on hydrogen storage. But again, thank you very much. This has been Bill Rees, Professor Emeritus, University of British Columbia, co-inventor of the ecological footprint. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for joining us here at the UT Energy Symposium.
It's my pleasure. I hope I've given you something to think about. And